Welcome to the CPA GHD Vlog Podcast. My name is Corey Kim, and today we're going to be talking about voluntourism and the impact it has on global health. Today we're here with Shaun Cleaver, who will give us better insight by helping us deconstruct voluntourism and help inspire us today. How are you doing today, Shaun?
Very well, thank you, Corey. How are you?
Good, I'm doing great. We have a couple questions for you. Let's get started.
Great.
All right. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself and your global health experience?
Certainly. There's now a lot of stages to that story, so I'll try to keep it brief, but might draw back upon some elements of it as we're talking. So let's start with the present. Currently, I'm doing my PhD at the University of Toronto, working together with groups of persons with disabilities to get a better idea of what it's like to have a disability in Western Zambia and what could be done about it, thinking about how our profession as physiotherapists might be able to tie into the needs that people express. Prior to coming here, I had a few short stints in sub-Saharan Africa, one doing some disability research in Cameroon, another one working with some colleagues in Cape Town in South Africa, and another extended commitment that I had was in Haiti. Something that started in 2003 and then through a series of different engagements continued right up until 2010, which included some aspects of working as a clinical physiotherapist, some teaching for rehabilitation technicians, some program development and management things as well. And I'll go back all the way to my first experience, which was as a physiotherapy student, visiting northern Malawi doing general health activities.
Great, that's some really exciting stuff. You have a lot of extensive experience, as we can see.
Thank you.
Yeah. So the first question we have for you today is talking about the concept of voluntourism. Even though this concept is familiar to some, can you just give us a little bit more of a background on what it might be? Certainly.
Well, let's start at the beginning, at something that could be obvious for people, but just in case it's not, that voluntourism is a portmanteau. It's a combined word for volunteerism and tourism. The concept is basically that people travel outside their home area to engage in some sort of what they think is productive work. For physiotherapists, this often takes the form of leaving Canada and doing some volunteer work for a very short-term engagement, often 1 to 2 weeks.
Great. Let's go a little further with that. And can we talk about where voluntourism stems from and what is the allure of volunteering overseas?
Goodness. Where it stems from might be incomplete in my explanation, but let me identify at least a few things related to that. One aspect is that there are a number of people who have both the resources to travel, some skills that they see as being useful, and the desire to do so. Those three things come together to create a scenario where someone in this position of relative privilege and relative power is able to take themselves into another location, usually one that is subaltern or subordinate, where people face less privilege, where they have less resources. Often there is a sense of altruism behind it, that the person who would like to engage in this work wants to do some good, wants to use some of these resources that they have to improve the situation of other people. And often the focus is there. And there's a negligence towards the structure, toward the situation, where this is a privilege that's not afforded to the majority of humans on the planet right now.
Great. I think that'll give everybody kind of a better picture of what it might be and where it comes from. All right, so our next question for today is volunteerism has become an industry in some countries. So what are your thoughts on this and how it impacts global health? And how does it also impact local communities, and specifically how it impacts physiotherapy practice?
There's a lot to that question. So let me try to start at the beginning. I think that in our current economy, where people are constantly seeking out opportunities where they can earn a living or earn some profit, it should not be surprising that there's an industry that has sprung up to meet the needs of voluntourists. When we say that it exists in many countries, I suspect that it exists in most countries. In many countries in the global south, or what we could call receiving countries, where a business or an enterprise or even an organization might be responsible for accepting voluntourists to their own location, as well as businesses or industries that exist in what we'll call the global north, the rich world of Western Europe and North America, where there are companies that exist to facilitate the process of voluntourism from their own countries as senders. The impacts from it range between very good to very bad. If we go for the easy things, truth to the premise that voluntourists can contribute some useful things. And obviously, that often comes up as the rationale why people do this and why people think it's a good thing. What's often forgotten is the negative side effects from it. To pick some aspects that are more or less relevant to physiotherapy, there is a recently released video from an organization promoted service learning that draws upon some research showing the very important negative effects of voluntourists going to orphanages, how this creates a cycle of people coming in and out of the lives of the children living in the orphanages, which is not emotional arrangement that's ideal for women, especially as they're a growing being, and how it helps create additional orphanages related to the industry that you asked about earlier. That's a case where we can see that voluntourism can be quite negative. There's also a more widespread nefarious aspect to this, and that is that for this dynamic to even exist in the first place, there needs to be an imbalance in terms of privilege. This situation cannot happen unless there are rich people who see themselves as having a limited skill, able to take that to poor people. And I think that the concept of voluntourism causes us to focus on this aspect of altruism, which has some benefits to it, but overlook the deeper structural things and not engage in things that try to change the balance of why there's such an inequity in resources that are available among people, that some people have so much whereas other people have so little. With respect to physiotherapy, I see the effects as being biggest at the point of where the voluntourism happens. There's often an idea that the skills that physiotherapists have, as we're trained here in Canada or in Great Britain or the United States or Australia, are unquestionably relevant all over the world. I do happen to be a believer that the skills are often useful, but having a bunch of different countries, especially Haiti, and having seen how my worldview often did not connect with that of my patients, it really caused me to be more humble in what we can provide as physiotherapists. So I'm worried about voluntourism taking over the ability of physiotherapy to develop on its own indigenous course in places like Haiti, where there are a lot of voluntourists who go there. I think that physiotherapy can adapt and can evolve and can take many different faces, considering the different cultures and contexts that people live in the world today. And I'm not sure that voluntourism is a good force to see that happen. I think instead of beginning with the unquestionable idea that we can help, that we should begin by thinking about many of the harms that can occur, of many of the downsides that can be produced upon the people who were even trying to help in the first place, let alone their wider communities. By doing this, I think it will strengthen our capacity to identify the problems, not only on a widespread basis, but also as the ways that they might manifest themselves in different local contexts, and then preempt those problems. Sometimes that preemption might mean not engaging as a volunteerist. There are lots of scenarios that are likely not appropriate for voluntourism. And I don't want to get into listing them because that gets us onto the track of thinking of universals as opposed to the specifics. But if we want to think of a widespread one, the previous example with respect to orphanages might be one of those. So with a change in mind frame, I think we have a chance that individually and collectively, we as physiotherapists can start to change the way that we think about short-term engagement, which isn't inherently bad, as well as combining some of the skills that we can offer together with travel, which isn't inherently bad, and start to morph our activities into ways that come with more positives and fewer negatives.
Great. Do you believe that there are benefits to volunteerism, and if so, what are they?
Certainly. Again, I don't want to get into too many universals because this can change in a bunch of different places. But I'll start at one that I used to believe happened more often than I now believe it does. And that is that it can be a life-changing experience for people. Having worked in settings where there were a lot of volunteerists involved, there seemed to be a pattern of there being large numbers of people who would come for short periods of time and seemingly return to their country, their home country, which was often Canada and the US, to basically live their lives in the same manner. Few people would return, especially for extended periods. I would like to think that at least a small number of those people did change the way that they live in terms of recognizing their privilege, change the way that they think of political structures that cause many of the world's people to be systematically poor, to change the way that they consume, considering the interrelationship of environmental problems that we're having and how that's inflicting itself upon the world's poorest people. So I do believe that it has that potential. I often seem to see, though, that people would be at the level of being satisfied with their altruism and not taking it to these deeper levels of consideration as to how we can be as humans and how we can be as professionals and how we can be as physiotherapists, and those can have wider impacts. On a different level, I do think it's possible to build up relationships, especially long-term relationships, between volunteerists who are by definition in a power of privilege and between people who are in worse off scenarios. I think that with longer term relationships, there's a better chance to coax people along to higher levels of engagement, and that there can be a better awareness of how difficult and intractable some of the situations that volunteerists walk into are. I do also think that on the superficial, short-term, immediate level, there can be benefits. I just don't want to emphasize that because I think that so much attention is devoted to that point that it blurs our vision away from other considerations.
I like how you highlight the short-term benefit of voluntourism expeditions without shying away from the long-term effects it has on communities.
Absolutely, and there are some great communications and quotes about how people of privilege can best engage with people in disadvantaged situations. One of my favorite ones to draw upon is a speech by a man named Ivan Illich. It dates from the late 60s, and this man was a Catholic priest working in Mexico, speaking to a group of volunteers from the United States, basically telling them to go home and to never come back to Mexico. And his point was that that group of volunteers, which was primarily white, advantaged young men, was coming to Mexico with the idea of helping because it seemed like it was easier than facing the admittedly challenging times that the United States had with respect to race and socioeconomics in the late 60s. And Ivan Illich's comment on this was, to hell with good intentions. There's also another quote that talks about, and I wish I would have prepared for this by finding the source, but I will so that I can quote it next time. And it comes from an Aboriginal person from Australia. talking about how if you come to her environment to help her, she would prefer that you just not. But if you come because your liberation as a person of privilege and the problems that systematic privilege as well as systematic oppression cause, if coming to engage with people who are being oppressed and downtrodden means that your liberation is bound up with mine, then you're welcome. I think that if we mainstream those ideas into our thinking as a profession and as a global health enterprise, that it will people think about voluntourism.
Okay, so then let's say we have a clinician who's keen to embark on a global health experience with the intent to do good. So what advice would you give them?
I'm under the impression that in the Western world, and especially in the physiotherapy profession, we tend to be type A people. We want to see results, we want to engage in action. And there are some good things about that, and there are some bad things about it. One of the bad things about it is that our desire to achieve things, to do good, overshadows our consideration of other things. So what I would encourage that professional to do is to devote the time that they would otherwise spend getting visas, learning what the climate's like, how to find a flight itinerary to get from A to B, to find out the equipment that a place might need, to not do those things, and instead devote their time to learning about the situations of the places that they're interested in, to learn of some of the potential downsides, to spend a lot of time talking and thinking before making any travel plans. I'm happy to see that in Canada and in many other rich world countries of the global north, there is an increasing collection of people who are engaged in global health on a long-term basis. Some of time abroad, or none, considering that global health is an issue that transcends different places. But that we're having deeper conversations within the physiotherapy profession, and I think there are a lot of opportunities for people to have chats, for people to find literature to read, and to think more about how they fit into a greater context prior to going to another context.
That's really good insight, Shaun. Thanks for that.
You're welcome.
Okay, so our next question here is, how can you determine the differences between a physiotherapy global health position and a voluntourism expedition? And what are these key differences?
That's a difficult question, and I'm not sure that it would be a one or the other in many cases. I suppose if we picked the extremes, the cases that would be most clearly voluntourism are the ones that emphasize the do-gooding nature of the engagement and how easy it is to get into. If on top of that, the organization that's promoting it has a profit imperative, I think that would likely be voluntourism at its archetypical form. A global health position that would not be voluntourism often has an element of lengthy duration to it. So to spend a bunch of months to a couple of years in a country, typically with a voluntourism engagement being 2 weeks or less, because that's what fits into people's vacation breaks, it does not allow for the deep sense of cultural destabilization that we get when we're in a country for a longer period of time. And anyone who's gone through that process of culture shock knows that it's a very taxing and painful process. But if you survive it, in the sense that you stay in the setting and are able to persevere through it, usually you step out a changed person in your understanding of what can be. And going through that process doesn't make you a local, but it allows a much better appreciation of the local worldview. I experienced this most clearly when I'd gone through those processes of culture shock and was able to see other people who came on shorter term commitments who did not. So I would say that a definition of this archetypical global health position would be a long enough engagement to go through that process and then be a lot closer to a local worldview, which will have a profound impact on the way that you do your work as a physiotherapist and how you engage as in a place with a citizen, or a visitor, as the case may be. Typically, we'd be visitors outside of our country. I think what people should be on the lookout for are situations where you can leave your comfort zone, but have your comfort zone recreated for you. I think that really impedes our ability to grow. It impedes our ability to see the bigger picture and to connect with different places and how they might be different. So I would encourage people to look out for that. I do realize that a lot of people face situations where they want to contribute to some positives and they want to have some experiences, but their lives are constructed in a way that it only allows them a short period of time. So if people are willing to embrace the idea of situations that are safe in the sense of personal security, but are more culturally challenging, are more open to the ways that things can be otherwise as per the realities of other contexts, I suspect that they will be engaging in activities that are closer to global health positions than they are to voluntourism expeditions.
Thanks again, Shaun, for giving us really great insight on how we can differentiate between the two, which leads us to our last question for tonight. Global health is a difficult profession to get into. People who are early in their global health career are often those who may have created their own opportunities, either on their own or with any organization that is willing to take them on. How can clinicians initially get involved with global health without falling into the voluntourism trap?
Global health is an interesting enterprise because you are correct that it's difficult to get into, but for those of us who have engaged with it, it's obvious that there is such an endless amount of work that it's easy to stay into, unless you need an income, which complicates things a bit. So, on that matter, I completely recognize the difficulty that people face when they have an interest in global health and aren't able to find an obvious doorway in. I think that someone with the perseverance to talk to a lot of people will always find opportunities. I do think that an ongoing challenge to this process, at least in the foreseeable future, is figuring out one's finances, especially considering that the style of physiotherapy education is one that requires a lot of years of university right now in North America, which is often associated with a lot of debt, which doesn't make it easy to engage in work where one's poorly paid. And I also think that there's a disconnect between the life course, and that people are most available to engage in global health when they're fairly new grads, and less so when they're in their mid-career state with children at home and mortgages to pay and so forth. But all of this is a long answer to say that in talking to enough people, I think it's possible to identify opportunities that are there, and that a lot of the challenges are figuring out things that are more personal, in the sense that how do you manage your debt load while getting towards opportunities that don't pay very well? I don't think that there's a one-size-fits-all answer for that. I think that the processes often require trial and error by the people that do them. And I think right now it's a fairly... I think harsh is an appropriate word on this. I would say it's a harsh reality that global health is not an endeavor that you can get into to get rich. So when a person does have a lot of other financial obligations, that can limit their ability to get into the entire thing.
Awesome, awesome. So again, thank you so much today, Shaun, for sharing your insights. You've given us a lot of material, a lot of information, a lot of take-home messages, and most importantly, a lot to kind of reflect on. So before we kind of close this conversation, do you have Twitter, a website, or social media? How can our listeners contact you?
Right now, my biggest communication medium remains my email, which is quite simply Shaun Cleaver, all one word, at Gmail. That's ShauncLeaver. Right now I use Twitter, but interestingly enough, not for global health things. So I'll probably make a change and increase my online presence fairly soon, but as of now, I wouldn't recommend my Twitter handle as a global health source. But I would recommend a few websites and Facebook pages that I'm involved with. The first one is for the ICDR Students Group. ICDR stands for the International Centre for Disability and Rehabilitation at the University of Toronto, which has become a rather prominent force for global health and physiotherapy and rehabilitation. So look up ICDR Students on Facebook and you will find that page. I often post there. And there's also the ICDR website in general, which is icdr.utoronto.ca.
So we'll have those links in the description below. Shaun, I'd like to thank you once again for joining us and inspiring us today.
Thank you, Corey. I enjoyed this.